Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the fourth of this year's series of the Selden Society lectures. In addition to welcoming all of you here tonight in the Banco Court, I also extend a welcome to those watching us in Townsville, Mackay and Rockhampton. Oscar O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, were he alive today, would no doubt be a celebrity of immense influence. He would surely have a larger Twitter following than Katy Perry or Justin Bieber or any of those who emerge from that remorselessly talentless troupe of Kardashian clones. Wilde was a simply extraordinary character who captured the attention of the press, society, Parliament, like no one else. He has left us with a repository of witticisms and aphorisms which can be drawn upon by the unimaginative at any time and for any reason. For instance, did you know that he said, "I sometimes think that God, in creating man, somewhat overestimated his ability." Well, the Selden Society did not overestimate its ability when it asked Alan Wilson to present tonight's lecture. The Honourable Alan Wilson QC was a judge of the District Court, a judge of the Supreme Court, and President of the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal. He has a voracious appetite for literature at the finer end of the spectrum, and that, with his other manifest skills, has served him well in his post-retirement life. In that life he's done many things, but he has been particularly useful, exposing to others the arcane skills of judgment writing, in particular to new and sometimes not so new judges for the National Judicial College. I particularly owe him a debt of gratitude for that. My judgment writing hasn't improved, but I know what I can do now. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight he will speak to us on the topic, The Trials of Oscar Wilde. Alan Wilson.
Thank you, Justice Martin, and good evening. On the 14th of February 1895, Oscar Wilde's artistic career reached its zenith when the play generally regarded as his best, The Importance of Being Earnest, opened at the St James Theatre, London. One of the leading actors in the play, Alan Ainsworth, said, "In my 55 years of acting, I never remember a greater triumph than that first night." 4 days later, the Marquess of Queensbury left a card at Wilde's club, the Albemarle. It read, "For Oscar Wilde, posing Somdomite." With that small misspelled card, what Wilde's grandson Merlin Holland has called an unfurling tragedy began. It ended with Wilde's disgrace, imprisonment, and early death. The story of Oscar O'Flaherty Wills Wilde is a story of genius, of love, of hubris, and ultimately of a kind of self-immolation by litigation. Love was the key to Wilde's downfall, but not only because of the nature of that love. One of his greatest mistakes was to allow his beloved, Queensbury's son, Lord Alfred Douglas, known to everybody as Bosie, to manoeuvre and inveigle him into that fateful litigation. Of course, his affair with Bosie occurred, as the best of his biographers, Richard Ellman, has said, in a clandestine world of partial disclosures, blackmail and libel suits. And it was that world which formed the backdrop to his downfall. That dark curtain behind the stage only loomed because Wilde's love for Bosie was, at least in its physical manifestation, against the law. It was known at the time as the love which dare not speak its name. The last vestige of that legal condemnation only disappeared this year when Wilde and 50,000 others were pardoned under what is called in England the Alan Turing Law, the UK Policing and Crime Act of 2017. Queensland has only recently followed suit. Wilde's genius was, as much as anything, one of personality. He was larger than life, and he had a remarkable facility for witticisms and bon mots, many of which live on. But he was also highly intelligent and highly talented. Richard Ellman is not just a biographer. He was the Goldsmith Professor of English Literature at Oxford, and he said this about Wilde: "We inherit his struggle to achieve supreme fictions in art, to associate art with social change, to bring together individual and social impulse, to save what is eccentric and singular from being sanitised and standardised, to replace a morality of severity by one of sympathy. He belongs to our world more than to Victoria's." Wilde's hubris can be traced to some combination, Ellman said, of his dandyism, his aestheticism, extravagance, flamboyance, imagination, self-advertisement, ambition, recklessness, and indiscretion. We'll return to it because, as his cross-examination by Sir Edmund Carson during his trial revealed, it was his Achilles heel. It meant that he could not resist making self-adulatory remarks which at times veered too close to the foolish and ultimately did much to bring him down. Wilde was born into financial and intellectual privilege in Dublin in 1854. His father was a prominent surgeon and irrepressible philanderer, and his mother Jane was a poet and Irish nationalist. We can see Wilde's genes vividly in her. In her correspondence, she called herself not Jane, but Speranza. She had, it is said, a sense of being destined for greatness. She said of herself that she would like to raid through life. This orthodox creeping is much too tame for me. She told William Butler Yeats, "I want to live in some high place because I was an eagle in my youth." Wilde once announced that he and his mother had decided to found a society for the suppression of virtue, and as Ellman points out, it says something for their kinship of minds that either might have originated the idea. It is not at all difficult to see where Oscar might have gotten the idea that life was special, and that, as much as anything, life was performance. He was a bright child and a clever young man. He read classics at Trinity and in 1874 won the Berkeley Gold Medal, the university's highest award in classical Greek. He went to Oxford with a demyship and read greats at Magdalen and graduated with a double first. His poem Ravenna won the Newdigate Prize in 1878. While at Oxford, he was strongly influenced by Walter Pater and his theories of aestheticism, a philosophy neatly, if a little brutally, captured in the aphorism, "art for art's sake." Pater wrote in a way that now seems florid and overexcited, but something in his style attracted the bright young men of Oxford at the time, like Wilde and Gerard Manley Hopkins. He described the ideal life in words that plainly resonated with Oscar. To burn always with this hard, gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy, is success in life. Pater also, unforgettably, said that we should get as many pulsations as possible into the given time. It's a phrase that, once in your mind, is hard to get out. His influence on Wilde was profound. If nothing else, Pater gave him an intellectual cloak for his natural predilections, flamboyance in dress and behaviour and speech. After Oxford, apart from 2 brief visits to Ireland, Wilde always lived in London or on the continent. He had produced lyrics and poems during his days at Trinity. His poetry was collected as early as 1881 and published in a style which typified his artistic theories and beliefs. It was not enough that the poems should speak for themselves. They appeared in a volume bound in a rich enamelled parchment cover, embossed with the gilt blossom and printed on handmade paper. In 1882, Wilde toured America, which largely went mad about him. He dressed extravagantly and spoke, according to the New York World, in hexameters. He told Americans that he was there to diffuse beauty, and I have no objection to saying that. He met everybody, including Whitman and Longfellow and Henry James and Oliver Wendell Holmes, and almost everybody wanted to meet him. He lectured the Americans on the need for a new birth of the spirit of man to be achieved. He said, through a more gracious and comely way of life, a passion for physical beauty, attention to form rather than content, and a search for new forms of art and intellectual and imaginative enjoyments. He tried a number of things in the 1880s: playwriting, short stories, essays, and even magazine editing. In 1884, he married into a legal family. He married Constance Lloyd, the daughter of a well-known London silk who had a generous allowance from her father. They had 2 sons, Cyril, born in 1885, and Vivian in 1886. But it was also in that year, 1886, that his life became more complicated. He met and fell in love with a man, Robert Ross. Insofar as it was possible at that time, Ross was what we would today call out. He remained a staunch and loyal friend throughout Oscar's successes and travails, was with him at the end, and became his literary executor. Wilde is remembered today for his 4 great comedic plays, his other scandalous play, Salome, his tragic poem, The Ballad of Reading Joe, his very long letter to Bosie, written while he was in prison and published after his death as De Profundis, and for his novel, The Portrait of Dorian Gray. First published in a magazine and later in a revised form as a book, Dorian Gray caused a sensation. Its plot device is well known. The central character unconsciously enters into a pact with the devil, and as he grows old, his appearance remains youthful, while a portrait of him ages hideously in his attic. What is less well known is the book's moral ambiguity, which was shocking at the time. 2 features of the book were also factors in Wilde's subsequent trial and downfall. First, its emphasis on male beauty, the effect upon the hero of a French book, A Rebours, English translation, Against Nature, by Joris Karl Huysmans, published in 1884. Under the influence of that book, Gray experiments with vice in all its forms. It is said that he ruined men and women alike. Wilde met Bosie in June 1891. Bosie was a student at Oxford and a budding poet. His contemporaries say, and photographs confirm, that he was very good looking. Wilde had given his character Dorian Gray a face like ivory and rose leaves. As Oscar's letters make clear, he thought the description applied to Bosie too. Like Robert Ross, Bosie made little effort to hide his sexual bent. That was not as controversial as it might sound, despite the era. Times were changing. As one vocal student friend and supporter said, if Bosie has really made Oxford homosexual, he's done something good and glorious. Like many tragedies, what's striking about the saga of Wilde's downfall is the recurring presence, plain in retrospect, of irony and coincidence. Wilde's first dealings with Bosie involved helping him with the threat of blackmail from someone who'd gotten hold of one of Bosie's indiscreet letters. Wilde put him in touch with Sir George Lewis, a prominent solicitor, who had previously helped Wilde in a similar scrape, and he sorted Bosie's matter out with a payment of £100. Lewis later represented the Marquess in Wilde's proceedings, at least when they began. From the first, Wilde and Bosie's relationship was redolent of the risk of blackmail and the presence of lawyers. Wilde's already flamboyant and expensive lifestyle accelerated under the effects of his affair with Bosie. His play Lady Windermere's Fan was a great success, and he spent much of its profits on rich living, with Bosie as a principal beneficiary. But Wilde's life also changed in another, more dangerous way. Bosie was fascinated by young men who, for a few pounds and a good dinner, would prostitute themselves. And he took Wilde into that world. Bosie already knew a man called Alfred Taylor, who introduced them to a number of men, most of whom were young, uneducated, and in poorly paid menial positions or out of work. Taylor and some of these men played a central role in the later trials. Bosie also came into Wilde's life with terrific baggage in the form of his family, and in particular his father, John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensbury. Pugilist, poet and philanderer, Elman describes Queensbury as someone who was always raging publicly and indecorously against someone else's creed. He fancied himself as an aristocratic rebel, socially ostracised because of his iconoclasm. Queensbury quickly came to the view that there was something amiss in his son's relationship with Wilde. He thought he had a lot to worry about where his sons and homosexuality were concerned. His eldest son and heir, Drumlanrig, was private secretary to the Lord Rosebery, Gladstone's foreign minister, and Queensbury suspected that they were having an affair. In 1893, he followed Rosebery to Bad Homburg with a dog whip and was only dissuaded from using it by the Prince of Wales. Drumlanrig died in 1894 in what was described as a shooting accident, but may well have been suicide. The Marquess's worries at the time did not end with his sons. Later that year, 1894, he married for the second time to a young woman who left him almost immediately and started proceedings for an annulment, alleging, and I quote, malformation of the parts of generation, and I quote again, frigidity and impotency. A father of 4, divorced by his first wife for adultery, he was now in the public eye again for highly embarrassing reasons. His 3 sons all seemed to him to be of dubious character and were disrespectful, and only his daughter was at the time not estranged from him. He'd been delighted when Bosie went up to Oxford, but was devastated when he left without taking his degree, and he blamed Wilde. All of this made his behaviour more eccentric and outrageous. Elman says, this man would prove to be a formidable antagonist, eager for public gestures, as arrogantly indifferent to Wilde as Wilde to what the world thought of him, and much less vulnerable. The events which led to Wilde's downfall began to coalesce. In April 1894, Queensbury wrote to Bosie, I come to the more painful part of this letter, your intimacy with this man Wilde. I am not trying to analyse this intimacy, and I make no charge, but to my mind, to pose as a thing is as bad as to be it. With my own eyes, I saw you both in the most loathsome and disgusting relationship. Bosie replied with a telegram, capitalised, what a funny little man you are. His father wrote back, "You impertinent young jackanapes, I will give you the thrashing that you deserve." Queensbury began to do what we would now call to stalk Oscar Wilde. He accosted Wilde in cafes and in his home. Wilde seems to have taken all this reasonably well and managed indeed to both calm and charm Queensbury during some of these encounters, but they must have been fraught. And Bosie exacerbated things. He wrote to his father saying that he was now carrying a pistol and that Wilde would prosecute him for libel. Wilde found himself, as Frank Harris described it, between the bark and the tree. He had become an instrument in Bosie's ancient battle with his father. Knowingly or not, Bosie was acting in a way in which he appeared to demand positive action from Wilde as a token of his love. In February 1895, Queensbury threatened to create a scene involving a large bouquet of vegetables at the opening night of The Importance of Being Earnest, but was diverted. Oscar, hearing of the threat, had consulted a solicitor called Charles Humphreys about an injunction. A few days later, Queensbury left the critical, abusive card at the Albemarle, Wilde's club. Wilde didn't see it for another 10 days, but when he did, went immediately with Bosie and Robbie Ross to consult Humphreys. The solicitor asked him if there was any truth in the implied allegation of sodomy, and Wilde denied it. But he told Humphreys that he couldn't afford litigation. Bosie intervened and guaranteed the costs because he said his family had suffered too long from his father's irrational and abusive behaviour. They all went to the Magistrates' Court in Great Marlborough Street to start a private prosecution for criminal libel. A warrant was issued and Queensbury was arrested the following morning. Sir George Lewis appeared briefly for him, but then passed the matter to another solicitor called Charles Russell. Times have thankfully changed a bit. The case features several events that surprise us today. So, for example, Russell consulted the Chief Justice, who happened to be his father, about suitable counsel, and Lord Russell recommended retaining Edward Carson. Carson had only been admitted to the English bar a short time earlier, but in Ireland he had a stellar reputation as leading counsel, and he had taken silk there in 1889. He was a contemporary of Wilde, and they'd been at Trinity together, and he was initially reluctant to take the brief. Russell, funded by Queensbury, engaged private detectives who quickly found Alfred Taylor and in his flat a kind of postbox containing the names of boys with whom Wilde consorted. The solicitor showed this evidence to Carson, who, still reluctant, consulted the former Lord Chancellor, Lord Halesbury, who urged him to take the case. College loyalty faded before Protestant morality. When Wilde heard that Carson was to lead the defence, he's quoted as saying, "No doubt he will perform his task with all the added bitterness of an old friend." At this early stage, ignorant of what Queensbury's detectives were digging up, the principal worry for Wilde and his lawyers was whether a jury might think that Dorian Gray was an immoral book. Frank Harris agreed to testify that it was not, but he and George Bernard Shaw also met Wilde at the Café Royal and tried to talk him out of the prosecution. No jury, they said, would convict a father for trying to protect his son, and some letters from Wilde to Bosie, which had come into Queensbury's hands, would, as Harris and Shaw were concerned, suggest that Bosie might actually need protecting. Bosie was outraged by what he perceived as the disloyalty of Wilde's friends and dragged him out of the cafe. Wilde himself was upset with Harris and Shaw. The law required that a defendant in a libel action enter a plea of justification with particulars before the trial began. Queensbury's pleading accused Wilde of soliciting 12 boys, of whom 10 were named, to commit sodomy. This was shocking, but again, Wilde denied all of the allegations to his solicitor. Another count alleged, as expected, the immorality of Dorian Gray. We know much more about the trial today than any of Wilde's biographers, or indeed any commentators in the 20th century. Until 2000, it was thought that a full transcript did not exist, so that, for example, the notable British trial series on Wilde's trial, published in 1848, contained a report of only 30,000 words. When Merlin Holland, the son of Wilde's son Vivian, was helping the British Library prepare a celebration of Wilde's centenary in 2000, what appeared to be a verbatim transcript of 85,000 words was discovered. It looks genuine. There are notes from 8 separate shorthand reporters. It was later published with a commentary from Holland and an introduction by John Mortimer as Irish Peacock and Scarlet Marquess. I am indebted to one of the Douglas clan, Justice James Douglas, for alerting me to the presence of the book. The trial opened on the 3rd of April 1895 at the Old Bailey before Mr Justice R. Hen Collins. Sir Edward Clarke represented Wilde. A former Solicitor General, he'd made a name for himself in high-profile cases, including one in which he had fearlessly cross-examined the Prince of Wales. But it's generally accepted that Clarke made several serious tactical errors. The first was that he had prepared his opening before he saw all the salacious allegations in Queensbury's justification, and he did no more than add in a short reference to them in dismissive terms. He said, "These people who may be called to sustain these charges are people who will necessarily have to admit in cross-examination that they have themselves been guilty of the gravest offences." In Clarke's defence, of course, he had clear instructions from his solicitor that the allegations were untrue. The second mistake was to introduce during his opening one of Wilde's more compromising letters to Bosie, which the defence had not, in fact, previously known about. It handed Carson another weapon. The third mistake, involving the later abandonment of the prosecution, was the most influential, and we'll return to it. There was possibly a fourth: the introduction into evidence by Clarke of letters mentioning the names of Rosebery and Gladstone. Publication was suppressed by the judge, but the names did appear in the continental press and probably made it inevitable that Wilde would be prosecuted when the Queensbury case was over, whatever its outcome. Had that not occurred, there would have been cries of a cover-up, of course. Clarke's first witness is the hall porter of the Albemarle, who confirms that Queensbury left the card. Then he took Wilde through his evidence in chief in a workmanlike fashion, establishing in effect that he had been stalked by Queensbury. During some of those earlier confrontations, some accusations had been made by the Marquess about Wilde's relations with Bosie, and Wilde denied them. Carson Rose. The Daily Chronicle of 4 April 1895 describes what followed over the next 2 days. A duel of thrilling interest. Mr. Carson's wig throws his white, thin, clever face into sharp relief. When he is angry, he assumes the immovability of a death mask. He is deliberate to the extreme. Carson's cross-examination has been much praised. It's true, as Ellman says, that Carson had so much evidence and of such a kind that he only needed to be persistent, not clever. But his genius was in the way that he ordered and structured his questioning. That said, he did manage to inflict a flesh wound with just his first few questions. Oscar had said in chief that he was aged 39. Carson had known him as a child and drew an admission that he was, in truth, over 40, and that Bosie was only 20 when they met. It made Wilde look as sadly false and self-delusional as all who lie about their age, and also, of course, from the outset, like something of a predator. Carson's best strategic decision was to attack Wilde's literary pretensions first. I use pretensions because Wilde's confidence in himself and his artistic theories, a major component of what I've called his hubris, meant that he could not resist posturing and indeed being led into extreme and provocative remarks and exaggerations. The theoretical facade provided by Pater and aestheticism had been used by Wilde so often to defend his most confrontational writing that, as Carson could reasonably anticipate, he would be unable to resist trotting it out again. And because of its inherent flamboyance and extravagance, it was unlikely to impress a phlegmatic English jury. Carson spent a lot of time then on Dorian Gray. That was unsurprising. As I mentioned, the first version was published in a magazine, and it had drawn fierce condemnation for what was said to be both its immorality and its amorality. The later version in book form had been changed by Wilde to diffuse some of that criticism. One of the passages he deleted was seized upon by Carson. A male character is speaking to Dorian Gray. I have worshipped you with far more romance of feeling than a man usually gives a friend. From the moment I met you, I adored you madly, extravagantly, absurdly. I was jealous of everyone with whom you spoke. Carson asks, have you ever known the feeling that you describe? Wilde, I think it is perfectly natural for any artist to intensely admire and to love a younger man. I think it is an incident in the life of almost every artist. Otherwise, Wilde consistently advanced a simple proposition in his answers, that he was being asked questions about a work of art which ultimately had no necessary connection with the real world or his own life and could not be used to condemn him. That's not an unreasonable proposition, and left there might have provided some kind of shield. But Carson pursues the matter, and Wilde cannot help himself. I want an answer to this simple question. Have you ever had that feeling of adoring madly a beautiful male person many years younger than yourself? Wilde, I have never given adoration to anybody except myself. The court report says laughter. Oscar is playing to the gallery, but he is also playing a dangerous game. While he can argue that his art must be separated from his life, he is presenting himself as someone who is above common mores and conventions, who is arrogant, and it's doubtful that Wilde understood this until it was much too late. A flippant, even foolish person. The day proceeds like that. Carson circles, returns, and comes at Wilde from different directions. Wilde is subtle, elusive, and clever, and is not, as it were, caught except in one respect. Whether he was conscious that answers that are too clever may look like arrogance, he nevertheless plainly struggled not to score reciprocal points off Carson. There are also some more minor flesh wounds. Wilde admits that a book referred to within Dorian Gray is Huysman's Against Nature, but upon Carson suggesting to him that Against Nature is a sodomitical book, Wilde reverses himself and denies that it's the one that he intended to refer to. The evasion is transparent and unsuccessful. But on balance, and despite his attempts at amusing asides, Wilde has some success in resisting the notion that his books represent his lifestyle. He tells Carson, "You must remember that novels and life are different things." He maintains the same defence, again with some success, to Carson's attack on letters that he had written to Bosie. Those letters had some very romantic language. "Those red rose-leaf lips of yours should be made no less for music of song than for madness of kissing." But Wilde says, "This is all art, just art. You might as well ask me whether King Lear is proper or a sonnet of Shakespeare is proper. It was not concerned with the object of writing propriety. It was written with the object of making a beautiful thing." When Carson continues to chase him, he makes an effective, if typically arrogant, riposte. Carson, suppose a man now, who was not an artist, had written that letter to a handsome young man, as I believe Lord Alfred Douglas is, some 20 years younger than himself. Would you say it was a proper, a natural kind of letter to write to him? Wilde, a man who was not an artist could never have written that letter. The first day ends, not with Wilde ascendant, but as his grandson claims, full of confidence. I think the transcript suggests that that's a bit optimistic, but not entirely unreasonable. Oscar has played to the gallery and at times treated the court like a theatre, but the effect is not inconsistent with the idea at the core of his rebuttal of Carson's attacks about his writings and his letters, that he is a theatrical and flamboyant person, given to write and speak in terms which may seem to offend ordinary morality, but which are simply manifestations of his larger-than-life personality and cannot safely be relied upon to conclude that he is guilty of crimes in real life. There's an interesting sidebar to this summary of the outcome of the first day. It concerns the brevity and unreliability of the earlier transcripts and reports of the trial and the mistakes into which they led earlier biographies. Philip Julian's biography, published in 1969, said that Wilde had left a very bad impression on the jury at the end of day one, but Holland's transcript raises at least doubt about that. Wilde had not been able to fully suppress his natural bumptiousness, but he was entitled not to be unhappy as he left court. Carson sprang his trap on the morning of the second day. He got Wilde to admit that he knew Alfred Taylor. Then he suggested that Taylor had arranged dinners for Wilde with young men. Wilde initially denied it, but soon admitted that he'd been introduced to 6, 7, 8 young men by Taylor. Then that he gave money and gifts to some of them. Then that he entertained them in private dining rooms. Then in rooms he had taken in London hotels, and that he had taken some of them to Paris. Carson also gets Wilde to admit that all of these men are uneducated and do not share his interests in art or literature or the theatre. Carson asks Wilde about his relations with Edward Shelley, an office boy at his publisher's office, Alfonso Conway, unemployed, Alfred Wood, who was Taylor's servant, Charles Parker, an unemployed domestic servant, Walter Granger, Bosie's domestic servant, Herbert Tankard, a page boy at the Savoy, Ernest Scarfe, an unemployed valet, Freddie Atkins, a bookmaker's clerk, and Maurice Schwab. Slowly and steadily, as more names appear and Wilde admits each acquaintance, the sheer number and similarity of these encounters begins to make them appear more and more dubious, and Wilde's answers steadily more foolish and dangerous. Carson, then do I understand that even a young boy that you would pick up in the street would be a pleasing companion to you? Oh, I would talk to a street Arab if he talked to me with pleasure. and take him to your rooms if he interested me. It begins to look worse and worse. Carson didn't really need to suggest any illegal behaviour between Wilde and these men. The very number of them, the extravagance of Wilde's entertainment of them, his generous gifts of money and things like cigarette cases and clothes and the like, piled up and became a looming avalanche of unusual, indeed dubious conduct, for which only one possible explanation becomes more and more compelling. Carson does put allegations of a sexual nature with some of these men to Wilde, that they stayed in hotel rooms with him, that they slept in his bed, that he tried to put his hand in the trousers of one of them and the like, all of which Wilde denies immediately and the transcript suggests quite vehemently. But it is the oddity and the sheer number of the relationships which is doing Wilde's credit steady damage. Wilde admits that one of these men, Sidney Mayville, stayed the night in his rooms at the Albemarle Hotel. Carson, for the first time, puts this allegation: "Did any indecencies take place between you?" To which Oscar replies, "Oh, none at all." A moment later, Carson moves on to the seventh of these men, Walter Granger. Wilde agrees that Granger is about 16. I pause to say he wasn't, he was over 20. He served in rooms that Bosie shared with Lord Encombe. And then the explosion happens. "Did you ever kiss him?" "Oh no, never in my life. He was a particularly plain boy." "Why did you mention the boy's ugliness?" "You sting me, you insult me and try to unnerve me in every way. At times one says things flippantly when one should speak more seriously. I admit that, I admit it. I cannot help it. That is what you are doing to me." But in one indiscreet answer, Oscar has seriously damaged, if not destroyed, whatever credit he may have built up with his consistent denials of sexual conduct with these men. Suddenly, all of those denials and all of these relationships are cast in a different light, one in which physical appearance and by strong inference physical attraction play a role. Suddenly, an explanation for everything that is unusual about these relationships is supplied, not by Carson, but by Wilde himself. Carson's strategy of chipping away, using the wealth of evidence the private detectives have provided him in an undemonstrative but relentless manner, has paid the highest dividend. Shortly afterwards, Carson sits down. Clark briefly re-examines Wilde, but ineffectually. He hasn't been given sufficient instructions to even attempt to demolish the edifice that Carson has built, an edifice which to that point has not proved illegal conduct, but is logically inexplicable and mysterious without it. What else could possibly explain Wilde's relationships with all these men? Carson then opens Queensbury's case and now directly provides that explanation. He does so in a way that eschews melodrama or sensation and mirrors the structure of his cross-examination. He begins again with the literature. Dorian Gray, he says, is a book about a man corrupted by another man and who by such corruption is brought to commit, or the book suggests he has committed, this sodomistic vice. He talks about Oscar's letters and what he describes as Wilde's paradoxical conduct. Then he throws his bomb. Moving to the more painful parts of the case, he tells the jury that he is going to call all these men and that they are going to tell of being brought to bed by Wilde and the shocking immoralities he perpetrated. But it doesn't end there. Hotel staff are going to testify about seeing Wilde in bed with young men and of disgusting filth. Clark tugs on Carson's gown. They confer. Clark throws in the towel. He makes a belated attempt to have the judge agree to a verdict of not guilty based solely upon the literature. But Carson is merciless and insists that every element of Queensbury's plea be accepted. The jury conferred for no more than a few moments and agreed, declaring the libel to be true, published for the public benefit, and that Queensbury was not guilty. In yet another example of the way we all hope that things have changed, the presiding judge, Hen Collins, penned a congratulatory note to Carson later that day. "I've never heard a more powerful speech or a more searching cross-exam. I congratulate you on escaping most of the filth." The law moved quickly. Queensbury instructed his solicitor to send his files to the Treasury, and by mid-afternoon the Home Secretary, Herbert Asquith, had instructed that a warrant issue for Wilde's arrest. 3 weeks later, Wilde was tried jointly with Alfred Taylor. The charges against Wilde were of committing indecent acts and against Taylor of procuring them. Initially, there were also some conspiracy charges, but they were dropped before the trial. Wilde was denied bail. Sir Edward Clarke represented him without fee. He was better prepared and made a persuasive argument that Dorian Gray was neither evidence of corruption nor itself corrupting. He was able to establish inconsistencies in the evidence of the young men, and that some or all of them had blackmailed men they had known, and to argue that if that was the case, then they must have had nothing on Wilde, or otherwise they would surely have blackmailed him relentlessly. The jury was hung, albeit narrowly, as indiscreet jurors and the foreign press reported. Carson and others tried to stop a retrial. They thought Oscar had suffered enough. He was allowed bail, but otherwise his world fell apart. Bosey's family reneged on their promise to pay his costs of the libel case, and he was bankrupted and his possessions sold. His plays closed, and Constance went to Switzerland with the two boys, and he never saw them again. Clarke then made yet another tactical mistake. He successfully applied for separate trials of Wilde and Taylor. They would instead be tried consecutively. Taylor went first and was quickly convicted. The Solicitor General, Sir Frank Lockwood, prosecuted. If Taylor had been convicted, how could Wilde be acquitted on the same evidence? The judge, Mr. Justice Wills, summed up mercilessly. "It is the worst case I have ever tried," he told the jury. They were out for 3 hours and found Wilde guilty on all charges except one. Wills J. sentenced him in brutal terms. "You have been the centre of a circle of extensive corruption of the most hideous kind," and gave him the maximum, hard labour for 2 years. Wilde's imprisonment was hard and ruined his health. For the first 18 months he was not allowed writing materials or access to books. When that was eased, he wrote a 50,000-word letter to Bosey, later published as De Profundis. It's a remarkable document. Wilde chronicles the disastrous effect Bosey had upon his life and his work, but in very fair terms, recognising his own weakness and failings and attempting an accommodation of his suffering with a return to religious faith via self-realisation. Despite its insights, it is nevertheless flowery and overblown in parts, and much of it is an elegy to his lost greatness. Wilde purports to discover Christ, but personifies him as a kind of Christian aesthetic, saying beautiful things and writing wonderful poems. Wilde went to France on his release in May 1897 and lived on the continent in impoverished exile until his death on 30 November 1900. Bosey came to live with him for a time in Naples, but left when his father threatened to cut off his funds. Constance was also giving Wilde a small allowance, and she threatened to withdraw that too if they didn't separate. Robbie Ross stayed loyal, as did sub-friends like Max Beerbohm, but stories abound of a tragic figure cadging for drinks in the boulevards of Paris. One poignant encounter even involved Carson. He could still write poems which caught the popular imagination. The Ballad of Reading Jail was described by critics as remarkable and beautiful. It contains some memorable lines like, "Yet each man kills the thing he loves," but like so much of Wilde except the comedies, is full of purple stuff and for that reason unconvincing. Ellman says that he took to absinthe and lolled about with young men. Constance died in 1898, but he was still denied access to his children. Queensbury died, largely friendless, in January 1900. His son Percy, now heir to the title, came to see him on his deathbed. The Marquess gathered himself just enough to spit on his son. An ear injury that Wilde had suffered while weak and in prison was thought to have metamorphosed into meningitis, although Ellman is convinced that his final illness was syphilitic. He could still joke, and on his deathbed he told a visitor, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go." Some critics, including Ellman, hold that his work lives on. Certainly, the plays survive for their humour and wit. Another critic described him as perhaps the greatest actor of his time, and that's a conclusion that his writings, his plays, and even the trial transcript give some support. What he acted was a prodigiously good comedian, a writer of very funny dialogue, and a cultivated and charming intelligence. What he did not know he was acting in, of course, was a scene that Max Beerbohm called "making the unmentionable mentionable" and dealing a first blow to Victorian taboos. That's a story for another theatre. Our primary interest is forensic. Carson did a more than competent job. Even without the powerful evidence provided through Queensbury's money and the lethal advantages it brought, he would probably have won the case on the literature alone. His careful, detailed preparation, analysing Wilde's writings, meant that he'd already found plenty of ammunition to argue that Oscar was indeed posing. And that word brings up another great forensic advantage that Carson had. Queensbury was not, by any account, a thoughtful or subtle man, but he managed to exercise sufficient self-restraint, even in the face of evidence that a more direct accusation was true, to limit what had to be proved against Wilde. In light of what is otherwise known about the man Wilde called the Screaming Scarlet Marquess, the trap is at least surprising and in some respects remarkable. Why did Sir Edward Clarke abandon the prosecution? If Carson had begun to call his witnesses, Wilde's arrest was probably inevitable. But it was already likely because Wilde had been seriously compromised in open court. Had Clarke persisted and cross-examined the witnesses, he might have been able to discredit some of their evidence, as, indeed, he succeeded in doing in at least the first of the subsequent criminal trials. Another explanation has been ventured. Clarke is reported to have told social historian and court reporter C.H. Norman that he and Carson had a private discussion after Carson's opening, the upshot of which was that the case was likely to proceed for several more days, that neither side could afford it, and that if the case was dropped, nothing further would be heard of the matter. But that gentleman's agreement was not kept. If true, it goes some way to explaining why Clarke volunteered to appear for Wilde without fee in both the later criminal trials. Clarke did say this publicly in a letter to Robbie Ross. "It is impossible for me to forget that before I undertook the most painful case which I ever had to be engaged in, he gave me his word of honour as a gentleman that there was no foundation whatever for the charges, which were afterwards so completely proved." Clarke published his autobiography in 1918. There is no mention of Wilde or the cases at all. Thank you.
We are indebted to Alan for what was an exquisite excursus into the troubled legal life of Oscar Wilde, and we have learnt or been reminded of the clash between Queensbury and Wilde and then Carson and Wilde, and we have been afforded that through the extraordinary and extensive labours of Alan Wilson. Would you please again express your appreciation? There is one more in the series of Selden lectures this year, and that is the first of the Atkin lectures to be presented by the Chief Justice of Australia, the Honourable Susan Kiefel. I hope to see you there then, and I hope to see you outside for refreshments now. Good evening.